It's an honor to be here, and I'm very proud and excited to be part of CDHI because indeed I'm a scientist who wants to make a real world impact. And with that, I want to show you how I want to achieve that. So my focus is really on adaptive minds. If I can move to the next question. Yeah, okay. So today I want to talk about why adaptive minds matter and how we model that in computational psychiatry. Really give you a roadmap, look into empirical insights, what we know about adaptability, and how we can use that scientific knowledge to have a real world impact in mental health in particular. And I argue that we need, in order to do that, have a system level solution because I have studied economics. And then I want to share with you my vision, how to implement that with my Gearshift Fellowship platform. So there are 4 goals of today's talk. First, demystifying what models are in computational psychiatry. Then revisit some of the assumptions about mental health and build a system level perspective of adaptability, how to address some of the mental health issues around anxiety, depression, and ADHD. And eventually identify what is needed to do to make our digital interventions more tailored and more adaptive. So adaptability is a term that is multifaceted. Many people use adaptability for different contexts in different fields. And to understand what my framework of adaptability really contains, it's helpful to know a little bit about my path. So I started with an apprenticeship at the Graubündner Kantonalbank. I'm Swiss, went into banking and finance and consulting industry, and then went to Applied University to do to study business administration, thanks to UBS. And then really got excited about decision making and behavior at a more complex level to understand how the brain adapts. And with that mind, I went 8 years ago to the US, where I was very fortunate, with the help also from Swiss NSF, to kind of tailor my own dissertation or doctoral program. So I was studying mathematical psychology, enrolled into a graduate school of neuroscience at the medical school. So I dissected brains of people who were dead. And I did clinical internships, so working with kids and adolescents, administering neurofeedback, talking to patients, and so on. And then I joined Michael Frank's lab for 3 years, where I was a postdoc, where I guided with him computational models across different departments, interinstitutionally collaborating on what exactly is depression and obsessive compulsive disorder. And now I'm very excited to be at the Center for Digital Health Interventions to figure out how can we improve adaptability within an ecosystem approach. Because as you could imagine, in my own path, I had to adapt a lot across cultures, across different institutions, across different companies. And I have been wondering, what is it that really makes us optimally adapt to the different circumstances and find opportunities no matter what the difficulty is? So with that mindset, I want to build an integrative theory that redefines adaptability as engineered reorganization of meaning. Not only as in terms of behavior, but in terms of how we find agency when we lose control, and how we find meaning when we have to adjust because of circumstances that we haven't foreseen. And what that exactly means, and I will talk a bit later, but if you appreciate the concept of adaptability under this slide, what that means is that it's really a key driver in so many different contexts. So at workplace, humans must adapt all the time under high pressures and uncertainty. And the question is, how do we decide when to persist, when to let go, and when to shift gears? And in mental health, similarly, adaptability is the core underlying across the most health interventions, because we know that symptoms fluctuate, people get stuck, and we need to have personalized care. But the question is, when do we intervene, for how long, with what kind of tools, and when can we release that interventions and let people just go? And so the question is, how do we recognize maladaptive strategies before we get stuck where we can't really intervene anymore? And that is kind of the basic core that would allow us to address mental health with digital interventions. And similarly, in artificial intelligence, it's a huge progress that we have made with OpenAI. We can use these tools. We have adaptive agents, but we also know their limitations. They are really good in high specialized tasks, but when goals change, or when we have this reasoning across multiple chains of thoughts, then they falter. And that's because we still haven't quite figured out how we induce meta-learning. How do we decide which strategy to apply in which context? So to understand these how questions, it's important to understand the mechanisms. What path guides us through adaptability? And to understand these mechanisms, we are using computational models, but even if I would tell you today the cure of this is the holy grail of how we adapt, we would still not be able to cure mental health issues or to make artificial intelligence more effective or more tailored to us, because we also need purpose, motivation, and an ecosystem where we can implement that. And so my mission is really to understand and engineer adaptability across these brains, minds, and machines to have a real-world impact. And with that, I want to show you a little bit a roadmap into computational psychiatry and what we believe our underlying assumptions are when we use different models. So we are using as inputs multidimensional data. So behavioral measures, cognitive tasks, passive variables, eye tracking data, EEG, clinical questionnaires. And we have artificial intelligence tools that you can categorize very roughly in computational models, machine learning, agentic AI. The question is how we find markers for pursuing 4 different goals. So deconstructing symptoms, which means we want to use these markers or model parameters to know what neural activity or what physiological variability in a specific data stream is really guiding what kind of behavior. We also want to use these parameters to understand and identify unobserved patterns in the data so that we can group people to make them more tractable for a specific intervention. We want to understand what is the active ingredient in a treatment so that we can say who is likely a responder, who is a non-responder, and we want to predict trajectories. But with that, you might already ask yourself, are these different models equally well suited to address these 4 goals? And so one of the things that I want to highlight is that the computational modeling, machine learning, and agentic AI are tools that in combination are the most fruitful, but they are also serving different purposes. And I always like this cartoon where I highlight that the instrument that you are using is basically determining what you measure. If you use a specific fisher net to characterize the species in a sea, then you will conclude, depending on the size of the different holes, that there are specific fishes that are existent and specific fish that are not existent. And the same is when you use these models. And I think it's very important to understand that computational cognitive models are those models that explain mechanisms, that try with biological inspiration to understand, to decompose behavior and to understand what different aspects play a role at what stage of the decision-making process. And so the focus is on interpretation and causal hypothesis. Machine learning often uses high dimensional data to predict patterns, symptoms, or treatment responses. The focus there is not so much on understanding why or the mechanisms behind it, but more making accurate predictions that are generalizable. And agentic AI hopefully helps us to understand how do we adjust strategies and actions, in particular when goal changes, and how do we dynamically pursue and proactively adjust in real time the system to an environmental change. So me and my collaborators have shown the combination is most fruitful to predict and to treat mental health conditions. We have shown that in ADHD as well as in depression and in other domains. So today I want to focus on the computational cognitive models that are really the backbone of the mechanisms, and then later elaborate how we can integrate that with machine learning and agentic AI. And for understanding computational models, let's go into the empirical insights that we have, where we have used these models in real-world applications to understand what drives adaptability. So adaptability is a heterogeneous concept. We know actually quite a little bit about it. So first of all, irrespective of the psychopathology that you look, whether you look into anxiety or depression, there is something that these mental health conditions have in common, namely rigidity. Rigidity in belief, updating belief, rigidity in changing behavior. We know that it's heavily dependent on how much you can self-reflect. We know that from emotion theories, the way how you attribute a cause to a specific environment or to a specific feedback changes your how you appraise your emotions and how you react accordingly. And so the question is now, if we have all these theories, how can we use that for a real world case? And I want to show you that with Susan. So Susan is our case study for today. And let's imagine she is 24 years old. She just started at the University of St. Gallen, and she has some struggles. She's diagnosed since age of 10 with ADHD. But now she has really a hard time. She's failing her exams because she makes careless, impulsive mistakes. And she is also socially withdrawn. And her mother is very concerned because she has been an outgoing girl, many, many friends, and it's a completely new pattern. And her mother is very concerned that she might get some suicidal ideations. Now, we can use computational modeling to understand what are potential problems because she transitioned from home to grad school. We can look at adaptability at these medium-fast mechanisms. Then we can use brain studies to understand why does she make careless mistakes in a school setting. And we can use cognitive study to understand how do we best treat her. So you might already notice that I use deliberately Susan, which is a woman, 24 years old, and it's not fitting the classical picture of someone who has ADHD. And that is because we often associate ADHD with a boy that flies through the classroom, intrudes others, impulsively interacting, very observant, that they struggle with a specific condition. But that could not be more far from the truth of what ADHD actually is. Because ADHD is often also characterized by exaggerated emotional responses, difficulties in transitioning across contexts and in social interactions, reading cues. We know that worldwide about 180 million younger adults are basically diagnosed with ADHD or a condition that very frequently co-occurs. So about 50% of people with ADHD are also diagnosed with anxiety. And so this is making our treatment extremely difficult. What symptom should you target first? How do you make sure that if you treat ADHD with stimulants, you don't exacerbate symptoms of anxiety? So the practical implication here is that even though we know that these symptoms are very diverse in ADHD, we often focus only on the cognitive aspects, and we are ignoring the difficulties in social contexts. Now, if we are creating digital interventions, this can be a problem because we are not treating where people are actually suffering. And so to understand how we could actually target such an exaggerated emotional response mechanism in ADHD, we need to better understand what triggers it and can we even measure it and how do we adjust it. And for that, I had conducted a neurocognitive study where we invited 68 younger adults. Half of them were female. They were formally diagnosed in treatment for ADHD, and they did different paradigms. And I want to focus today just on the social interaction paradigm, where we wanted to see, can we actually track whether people are showing these dysregulations in such a stylized context? So we used behavioral economic theories to create a social game where people had to collaborate with others in order to make some money. And so we systematically changed the context that they had to do so. They didn't know that we changed that. They were just exposed to them. But what we changed is like how much was at stake and how much was it actually risky to trust someone, and whether the counterpart was more or less pro-social. So to preview the main findings of our study, we found that ADHD showed increased cooperation in high-stakes situations. But the people without ADHD were more risk-averse, and that was leading to negative experiences for the people with ADHD. They often experienced that the willingness of cooperation was not reciprocated by their counterparts. And so at shorter time scale, they showed this very reactive adjustment, where they started to felt being screwed over and immediately withdraw. But over time, what we found is that people started to not adjust at all anymore. And so that shows now how we could use a paradigm to understand at what time scale is it actually that people adapt maybe too quickly, and at what time scale is it where people start to withdraw and not adapt anymore at all. So this is based on a paradigm in game theory, and you could now show what people have seen with looking at these payoff matrices. So we want to unpack now these results to better understand what mechanisms drives this adaptability in ADHD. So what you see here is a column player called participant and a counterpart, and it's what we also call a prisoner's dilemma, because what you see is your outcomes that you can get in the purples depending on what the other person is doing. So if both choose to cooperate, you get 10, but if both choose not to cooperate, you get 2. So clearly 10 is better than 2. But the thing is, if you decide to cooperate and you think that the other person is doing the same, you have an incentive to basically do the opposite so that you can get 17, even though at the expense of the other person getting only 1. So now this is inviting you to reason about what the other person is doing and to infer people's intention. And what we did is we looked into eye tracking of how often people looked at the on diagonal versus the off diagonal. And I show you here the data. So a higher color means people have looked more often at that specific location. And here you see a subject that looked clearly very often to their 17. So now what you see, the question what we want to ask is it really informative of what people look at, whether that is informing what they are going to choose? And what we find is, yes, it is actually. So the more you look at the cooperative choices, the more likely you are to actually also use to select these outcomes. And the question now is, how does ADHD look in comparison to the controls? And we find that under high stakes, they were definitely looking much more at the gains of cooperation, and they undervalued or ignored the potential risk. So you could now ask this question of, yeah, basically that is clear, they show impulsive behavior. They basically ignored the risks and they weren't really thinking about them. So, well, let's ask that in terms of response times. Because when we just look at the choices, we can't really say whether something is impulsive or not. And that is the beauty of using a computational model called diffusion decision model. So the diffusion decision model is a mechanistic model, and we can now graphically illustrate it without any mathematical equations. It's based on information theory that decomposes the decision-making process in different stages. So we have an encoding stage, a decision-making stage, and a response stage. And the choices that you have available is represented with these horizontal bars. And we say that you have an a priori belief or tendency towards a specific choice that we can reflect with this starting point. And the closer you are at this upper boundary, the more likely you are to very quickly make these decisions. So what this theory says is that we simulate this decision-making process with diffusion particles. Diffusion particles are based on relativity theory. They are used also in diffusion models of image processing. They are used in many, many different applications. And so it's not a surprise that we are using them also in cognitive psychology. So what it says is that you are sequentially bit by bit integrating information about what you should do. So first you think, oh, you should really approach this dog because it looks so funny. But over time, you might remember that as a kid, you were bitten by another dog that looked similarly. And so you are basically more and more tending towards avoiding this dog. So if we do that over time, each time we are basically getting confronted with something, we shift our prior expectation that we can represent with this parameter. And we can see how based on these shifts, we are now integrating information from different positions. Each time we hit such a boundary, we are recording the response times. And that's exactly what we are trying to do. So we use observable data, choice and response types, and we try to reverse engineer what components has led to this behavior. So there are 4 main model parameters. The model has been established by my PhD mentor, Roger Radcliffe, 1978, and it has withheld since then in economics, in health settings, in neuroscience, and so on. So because of all these applications in these different settings, we have a good understanding of what these parameters mean. So starting point is what your tendency is before you see anything. Boundary separation is your cautiousness or versus your impulsiveness. Drift rate is how good you are in processing what we present. And non-decision time are motor execution and encoding in different areas of the brain. What is unique is that each of these parameters, there are only 4 and a couple of others that I'm not presenting, is describing complex data, really getting out this unobserved signature in these response time distributions and in the relative choices. Data that would otherwise be very, very complex to summarize. Plus, we are leveraging response time and choices. This is a main benefit over other computational parameters. Now, if we can use these parameters and now think, is this impulsive behavior, is this risky behavior in ADHD because of impulsivity? So let's look at 2 different timescales. What happens in the short run? In the short run, we would expect that they would adjust their starting point very, very quickly if they are driven by impulsivity. And that's indeed the case. So what we find is that what I show you on the x-axis is severity of ADHD, and on the y-axis is the magnitude of change in your beliefs. And what we see is a positive correlation. So the more you suffer from ADHD, the more likely are you to basically shift very quickly back and forth your prior belief. But what happens over time when we are looking across the different settings? Now, what we find is that exactly the opposite. Instead of having lower boundary separation that would indicate impulsivity, we find higher boundary separation for ADHD. So that means that they are more cautious over time, adjusting how exactly they respond. So that is very interesting, because what it now means is that ADHD is not always context-independent impulsivity. Whether you want to treat impulsivity depends on the timescale that you look at. And to design effective interventions, we need to understand which timescale is leading to what kind of problems. So coming back to Susan, we understand now that, yeah, at a longer time scale, this is why she withdraw from interactions. She might have been very risky in the very beginning to meet new friends at high school. She had negative experiences, and now she basically withdraws. But the question is, how does this connect to her problems at homework and during the exams? And for that, we can now look into a study that I have been conducting with some neuroscientists, where we leveraged recordings within the brain. And why we did that is that we said impulsivity is not this universal construct, it is context dependent. So imagine these 2 different scenarios. In the top level, you are confronted with a dilemma. You see that there is a red arrow pointing to the right. So saying you should go right. But if you look at the background and you look at the weather, you might actually want to go left, because left has the better weather. And that is a very different scenario from the situation below, where you also have to decide whether you want to go right or left. But this time you have no clue at all what you should do. So the question is, how does our brain arbitrate and slow down makes us slowing down to really make a deliberate decision and not impulsively acting towards a specific choice that we would immediately rue afterwards. And so for that, we can use biologically inspired neural networks. And I don't want to spend too much time, or I want you to think about the details, but what I want you to take on is that we have these loops between frontal cortex and subcomponents in the brain that we also call basal ganglia. And there are actually three distinct pathways. The indirect pathway and the hyperdirect pathway are known to give us the capacity to slow down when we see conflict and when we have to make a second deliberation to make a good decision. Now, what we knew is that the subthalamus is the one that makes the global brake, that pushes the brake and immediately shuts down our system to really think. But what we don't understand is, why do we have this indirect pathway? Could it be that impulsivity in OCD versus impulsivity in ADHD is because there are these different pathways that are differently disrupted? So we've asked the question, when we record from these different areas, can we find that people are slowing down, that the slowdown mechanisms are differently recruited? And what we find is that exactly that is the case. So we use the perceptual discrimination task because that is something that you can also administer across species. And we manipulated the amount of conflict and uncertainty. Invited people with intracranial electrodes in the brain because of their Parkinson, and asked to make these different decisions. We used these neural network models to simulate how people make decisions. You can see these are the trajectories in an area called striatum, where we think this integration of information that I showed you before is happening. You see that the trajectories look very similar to what I showed you before. But if we simulate the same with our computational model, then we see that these trajectories end actually much, much later. So why do I show you this? I show you this because I want to give this understanding that if we use different mechanistic models at different levels, some at the brain level and some at the behavioral level, we can start to align them. Because you can see that our behavioral model at the bottom looks a bit different than the one at the top. It starts much later than the one at the top. So what we did, Michael and I, is recalibrate this diffusion decision model to have a specific collapse, because we had this strong, based on these neural networks, this strong inclination that this model is not adjusting for what we want to measure. But we want it to be biologically plausible. And that's exactly how you do that. You across different multiple level of analysis, you align the models. So what we find when we record from these different areas is that conflict under high uncertainty, we have this specific indirect pathway that makes us deliberate more. But under low uncertainty, we have the STN. So we find that if we record from different components in the brain, we can create a paradigm where we can dissociate when is someone acting impulsively because of conflict under low uncertainty versus high uncertainty. Now, that is very interesting because it gives us now biomarkers that are not only predictive, but also interpretable, tracking it back to specific mechanisms. So we can design now interventions and use these computational models in a more deliberate way. So coming back to our case study of Susan, we can understand now why she makes these careless mistakes. If she makes these mistakes, particularly when there is conflicting information, it might be guided through this hyperdirect pathway. But the question is, do we really need these neurocomputational markers? Why can we not just use self-reported measures? There was recently a paper that showed that self-reported measures could actually be as good as computational markers. Should we really go all this way down and use this additional computational effort? For that, I want to draw on an interinstitutional clinical study where we had our kids, 142, be assigned to either active or shame neurofeedback. And in ADHD, what you need to know is that we have strong indication clinically that we have to dissociate between inattention and hyperactivity, because they are really determining what interventions do you want to assign. So people who are inattentive don't respond as well to specific type of stimulants compared to those with hyperactivity. Now, if you just ask teachers and parents, hey, rate people's inattention and hyperactivity, then what you find is this relationship, very strong relationship, because people have a hard time to dissociate. Is this inattention? Is this hyperactivity? So what we did is we asked the kids to actually perform a so-called continuous performance task. It's a clinical task where we want to see how often do people mind wander, how often do people ignore signals that asks them to stop a prepotent action. And we ask, can we now assign such a computational model to dissociate between inattention and hyperactivity? So when we did the analysis, what we found is that this marker of the quality of how good you integrate was lower in hyperactivity, the more hyperactivity you had. That is not surprising. We found the same for inattention, yes, because the kids with ADHD did perform worse on this task compared to those without ADHD or with lower symptoms of ADHD. But what you can also see is that there was this additional model parameter that clearly dissociated inattention from hyperactivity. So people with inattention had a much longer time to actually get started, get into the gears when they were confronted with a stimulus compared to hyperactivity. If we would just look at the response times, we would not detect it. If we ask people to just report their symptoms, we would also not detect that. So there is this interesting approach where we use these markers together with data-driven machine learning, where we can then see that we can now use that combined biomarker to say who is benefiting from neurofeedback with the active ingredient compared to the sham neurofeedback. And that is, there is much more research needed, as Danny Pine and I are currently summarizing in our latest review article. But I also want to highlight that we use these model parameters to understand active ingredients in treatments. And we have used these model parameters to also show that they are more predictive than classical task measures. So let's have an empirical synopsis of after hearing so much about the brain and so much about economics and all these things. So what I want to highlight is that even though we have a really good understanding about these different concepts across different fields, psychology, neuroscience, and economics, and clinical psychology, they are isolated, right? I showed you a study about social dynamics. I showed you a study about the brain. But how exactly this ties together, we don't know. But if you think about our individuum, if you think about people, then they are always within an environment. They are always within an ecosystem. So it's more like we want to actually solve a mobile where we are not sufficiently understanding the dynamics of the mobile if we just look at one part. And so our current focus in science has always been on trying to find these markers for selecting a treatment. What we see is that if we combine tasks and models, we might actually be able to do and provide this individualistic care because we understand why does someone act differently than another person. But we also know that these markers need to be able to deconstruct symptoms because symptoms are often context specific. Whether someone with ADHD shows impulsivity is not, it always depends on what kind of scenario you give them. So we need to appreciate that mental states change over time. And we need to understand that if they change across context, which makes just-in-time care very difficult. So now the question is, how do we get from these model-based markers to a real-world change? And there I vouch for a system-level approach. So for that, let's go and step back and let's put on our HSG hat and let's think about what exactly is the systemic problem of why research hasn't really solved the problem of depression and anxiety. So we first of all know that mental health care has three main problems, I would say. It's reactive and slow and ineffective. So there are many people who drop out, many people who have no access. About 1 in 100 people is actually getting the care that they need. We know many things about adaptability, about mechanisms, but we don't know how they tie together. And that makes our treatment still very unspecific. And we have these people that actually don't fit into the categories that we assign them to, but rather fit multiple categories and multiple symptoms. They have a shared commonality, which is dysregulation in emotion or in adaptation, transdiagnostic rigidity. Very often when I have been in the clinical setting or when I talk to clinicians, the first thing that you also want to give them is a bit better tools for self-management. So at the individual problem level, what we see is that healthcare supporters have not always sufficient time. They have not always the immediate data or information that they need. And the scientists, the computational modelers, only get this data of discrete snapshots, but it's a static learning process. It's you have one data of one person. You barely get a dynamic system that allows you to see how people adjust over time. And we have the people who are struggling with ineffective time use. They are very often confronted with the fact that problems exacerbate. So you start in a new setting. First, you just don't get any friends, but then suddenly you have also problems in your exam. So the different suffering causes exacerbate and makes it very complex to eventually see, why did I actually end up in such a situation? So we assume these generic stable mental states. And what we want to now solve is formalize these clinical theories, understand how do these different aspects of adaptability connect to each other, and how can we basically have also people who are suffering from a mental health condition informing our theory, informing and restoring their capacity for adaptation to leverage the treatments or interventions that we give them. And so for that, we have implemented conceptually something that we call supertask. Our goal here is to leverage what we know from clinicians, neuroscientists, business, people who study economics and business, to say adaptability is not just how you adjust your actions, but your capacity to recalibrate your motivation, your learning, and your agency. And for that, you need an environment that basically layers horizontally the different computational mechanisms that we have studied in isolation in these different context-sensitive models, so that we know how much of your adaptability difficulties are based on insufficient incorporation of feedback, insufficient reward, more sensitivity for avoidance, and so on. And so what we want to do is to create this supertask approach in a reconfigurable way so that it's continuously adapting to you and allowing you to see and gain insights into how you are coping with the different challenges that you are confronted with. And that's exactly the Ging-Jehli Fellowship platform. So it's not a digital intervention. What I want to envision is it should not longer be a standalone tool. We pick up these different interventions during crisis, but they don't live with us in an adaptive ecosystem. They don't teach us when to see the opportunity in a difficulty, when to help, when to guide us towards clinical care, or how we are making meaning of our emotions. And that's exactly where Ging-Jehli Fellowship offers this training ground. It's like a living lab where science and self-discovery is meeting. And this within a gamified platform where we have this intelligent generative AI agent basically delivering four main insights. It gives you real-time insights into why you behave in a specific situation, what could be different adaptation possibilities, and what kind of outcomes that would produce. It gives smart probing of the different mechanisms that we know are important. And it gives early warning signals before you become too stuck into a specific belief or in a specific behavior. So it teaches resilience together and explores resilience together with the user that is playing that game. So the goal is that we use this platform that that is engineered by our computational markers to create individual adaptability profiles in this naturalistic environment that is safe enough that you can fail, but sufficiently ecologically that you can adapt, that you can choose, that you can use the coping strategies in the real world too. And so we need to have it modular. We need to have it based on these computational models, ecologically valid, and with an intervention component that is basically telling you how to make the meaning out of the interventions that you are already imposing, like a briefing exercise, a cognitive behavioral therapy, and so on. So we have gained some, I have been securing some pilot funding from Brown University and the Swiss NSF, and with software engineers and game designers, we created Ging-Jehli Fellowship. So you run through these different missions where you are confronted with different obstacles. And this is now a video where I want to show you how it looks like. So you have the agent that is basically guiding you, and you are supposed to collect these different packages with different rewards. Sometimes there are obstacles, so you have to navigate and to decide when is something too risky. You have the headquarter agent that is always your ally, that gives you some indications how you are solving different challenges. There are perceptual challenges to also see attention and cognitive control aspects in our computational parameters. And we have also problem-solving skills. So sometimes you are succeeding and you do this alone, but sometimes you do this also in conjunction with other social partners. Some of them are kind, some of them are not kind. And you can decide how much do you want to learn on your own and how much do you want to learn yourself. Like in real life, how much do you want to depend on someone else and how much do you want to depend on yourself? So sometimes you succeed in this and sometimes you fail. We see in our studies that our game is producing lots of affective responses. People really get frustrated in this scenario when they see the other person is screwing them over. And we have the adaptive agent who is basically delivering you interventions based on logotherapy. So you are learning interventions by teaching it to the avatar. So for instance, you are told that your motorcycle is sad or angry, and you are asked to downregulate their frustration or their sadness and what to do, what you would do by doing so. So there are these different missions, and what we are currently showing is conceptual validity of markers that we have in the lab, which is making us confident that our markers are measuring what they are supposed to measure. We are currently establishing test-retest reliability, and we have launched clinical collaborations. Now the next step is to integrate these adaptive agents. And my goal here, and why I also joined CDHI, is to basically use their vision and their platforms to make it combined with Ging-Jehli Fellowship. Because Ging-Jehli Fellowship is the training ground where we see adaptability, where it becomes measurable with markers, improvable and visible. And so it connects existing interventions in this dynamic environment. So the goal is that you have these adaptive profile markers that are based on theory in clinics, based on theories in neuroscience. They are giving you these triggers of recalibrating the environment that then gives you the access to these different intervention tools so that you can now train how to appraise a new situation or how to cope with frustration with a briefing exercise. And then you can see in the real world, based on pressures, what exactly it produces that then informs back the agentic AI agent how to recalibrate the environment. So it would be the first automated closed loop solution about how you are delivering digital interventions in the mental health space in Europe. So this is our team. So the Ging-Jehli Fellowship team consists of a software engineer, Russ Childers. He is from BG Behavior, giving all the platforms, maintenance and backend. Madeline is our fantastic research assistant, and Rachel, who did all the game illustrations. We have the collaborators, of course, CDHI and Toby, most importantly, and Liber, Brown, and people at Berkeley and Ohio State who are implementing this platform in different studies so that we can collect data and see how it's basically used across different populations. And with that, I want to thank everyone, and we are always on the lookout for collaborators, investors, and partners. And there is also a QR code in case you want to watch a 2-minute video about the overarching vision of GearShift.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Virtual and real applause here everywhere. Yeah, now we see that. Nadja, you see it as well. Wonderful. Thank you so much for this very energetic and insightful talk. So now it's our job to ask questions or have comments here. So please, everyone, the online audience first, and we're second here on site in the room. Who is the first person? Okay, you still get applause here. Wonderful. Well, maybe I don't see any hands up, so I break the ice. Obviously, thank you so much. It's wonderful that we have you now with us at CDHI, Nadja. And you mentioned, I mean, we can probably improve a lot of digital mental health interventions out there. At the same time, we know that, for example, in Germany, you know, with the DGAS, prescription digital therapeutics, I think currently we have around 50 of them that are permanently listed. Most of them, or at least half of them, are in the field of mental health. So they have already shown some real-world evidence that they are working. What would you say, like, you know, and using your insights, how could we improve them even further?
So are you talking about interventions of
anxiety, depression, sleep disorders,
Yeah.
these kind of interventions?
So what my experience is that very often it's a specific user case, so it's not always effective for all the people who suffer with anxiety. And so the question is, how do you capture those who are basically dropping out? So what I see very often is that people start, they are very, very excited about something, but then adherence is very low. If you look 6 months later, the user case just dropped to below 50%. And the question is, how do you basically keep them within this intervention? How do you basically guide them through the different process? My hypothesis why these people drop out is because the intervention is static. It's not adaptive, right? So you are basically experiencing a high, let's say you have panic attacks because you are in an exam setting for a month, and then you are using these interventions and afterwards you drop it. But that might not solve your problem because the underlying cause of your panic attack might later disappear in another context, and it might actually be even worse, or you might come with depression, or you might basically get into a situation that it is difficult to get out again. So that is exactly the problem with these, with what we experience with these complex conditions like anxiety or depression, that very often then you lose the job, you just got divorced. There are these things that exacerbate, and at some point it's so big that it becomes very difficult to cope with it. And that's where people end up in either psychiatry or they become suicidal, like worst case, right? And so if we can create a tool that basically adjusts and says, now you don't really need to cope with panic attacks anymore, but let's look into how to keep these coping strategies more alive with the expectations that you have when you are under pressure, because that might have been the cause of panic attacks while you had these exams. Then the person the next time is much, much less likely to run into a situation where they re-experience these panic attacks again.
Okay, interesting. Maybe a follow-up on that one, right? I mean, there is a couple of paradigms how you would intervene. One is maybe more the preventive and proactive way, which is for example, let's stick to slow-paced breathing trainings on a regular basis to strengthen mental resilience, right? That would be a very proactive approach. And we have actually a project that starts now in October, or started last week, where we want to help teachers at schools, to better cope with stress in the everyday life. So we could adopt this approach to give them strategies so that they build up mental resilience, right? And then there's this other paradigm that, ideally uses everyday technology to identify vulnerable states in the moment. So we then know that they are now stressed in the moment and we want to help them. That's maybe not the best time, right? Because we would, with our intervention, even stress them more because it is triggered by a notification. However, the paradigm is to reduce acute stress when you're vulnerable, which is completely different to being proactive and, build up this mental resilience. The lessons learned from your research, do you think that can apply for both these kind of paradigms, or would you rather see it for one, for one of them?
I'm very glad that you asked that, because one thing that I didn't show in the video is that we have different game modes. And with game modes, we are basically exactly addressing this aspect. So someone who is in a very acute stress mode, they might actually try to go into such a game to escape, right? And their game behavior might be, when you are trying to escape, the last thing that you want to hear is someone telling, yeah, please reappraise your situation, right? Because you are you are already full of affective responses. You try to make meaning to kind of like resurface over the sea level. And there it's where the game will completely calibrate differently than in a situation where you are training resilience, when it's okay to face a challenge, to basically see how you adapt. If you are under acute stress, you don't want to face an additional challenge. But what would be nice if you are under acute stress is to have a buddy beside you and say, okay, let's take 5-10 minutes, forget about your problems basically in the real world, and let's go and find meaning in a virtual space where you basically can just also take a moment to breathe and to have an agent telling, okay, we could actually now start with little interventions that you don't have to think about, that you can just be. And I think there is where I would love the game platform to be tailored and adaptable. So depending on what you want, and people can select what game mode they want to play, whether it's exploratory, escape, or there is a third one, exploratory, escape, or self-discovery, something like that. So there are these 3 different modes, and depending on the mode, it's really a different type of intervention and accessibility to the interventions.
Cool. Yeah, well, I look very much forward, to integrate your findings into, as you said it, to some of our ongoing projects and to start a really cool collaboration. I'm just looking into the round. I have obviously some more questions, but here you are, Victoria.
So yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really insightful and it's so complex. I was wondering, completely at the beginning, you showed the case was the ADHD. So you had 68 participants, 50% were diagnosed. And for me, it's so multimodal. You have the ADHD, but then it could be overlapping with bipolar disorder, with anxiety. So how do you account for that? Because maybe bipolar could be then the driver, or ADHD. How do you do that then in such a study?
Exactly. So that is a really, really good question. And what makes me very exciting is that if we are just ignoring all this additional complexity, we already see very strong differences in our markers. So what we basically did in another study where we looked into depression to see how much of depression was because of anhedonia, because anhedonia is basically predicting whether you are responding to first-line treatments. When, depending on the paradigm that you have, you can now start to dissect further, right? So what we would want to see is that ADHD and non-ADHD are discriminating between these parameters. But if you then go into a more complex environment like the one that I showed you before, we have no new data where we can see, but this inattention is because there are daydreamers that have a hard time to keep their thought offline, but no problem in getting started. But then you have the people who have a very hard time to even get started. But once they get started, they are actually fine. So that is, for instance, a hypothesis that I published in the latest review article, where I argue that this is exactly what we can uncover with mechanistic parameters. But what it requires is that you have highly fine-tuned paradigms. Because it's like when you try to measure your medication with the luggage scale. I mean, luggage scale is kilograms, and you try to measure something that is in milligrams. If you are just using that scale, it says 0. There is nothing, right? But if you are using the right scale, that is basically optimized to measure milligrams, you do suddenly find the difference between a medication that is 15 milligrams and one that is 20 milligrams. And the same is here, the key message that the models alone will not solve it. It needs to have this super task or calibrated environment that together combines a situation where you can give interventions, but you give them in a very specific way to dissect the different mechanisms, so that you can say, okay, in this situation, when it's about how I interact with someone else, I'm actually very anxious and my anxiety symptoms completely hijack me. But in a situation where I have to study, I'm not anxious at all, and there it's my inattention that is hijacking me. And you would want to have an intervention for the inattentiveness that is different than the one for the anxiety, because they aren't solved by the same coping strategies.
So basically one needs a huge population to test everything, or?
I wouldn't say necessarily a huge population. I would say a controlled population longitudinally. Mm-hmm. So what you don't want, and what we still often do, is we, for multiple reasons, is just cross-sectionally, or having like just 2-3 different time points where we can basically observe. And the thing is that very often the task or the neuroscientists use are also completely boring and very abstract, and you can't really have people doing 2 or 3 times. But the models that they have are wonderful, you know, explaining how the different brain areas are interacting, and Michael and I show that we can use these models and connect it to behavior. That is very powerful. So the question is then, how do we use what they can offer, and how do we use it in a setting where we can leverage it for what we try to do? So it's also within subject variability that we are focusing on, not so much between.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question for that. I wonder, does the order of the interventions matter? Because I imagine different interventions are like different mechanisms.
The author?
The order.
The order.
Like how do you test different mechanisms?
Yeah, so that is a really fantastic questions as well. So how I would start is basically, I am a big believer when it comes to mental health to integrate what people with lived experience can say. So what you see here is that we have a huge beta user community that is consistent of people who suffer from depression, of people who suffer from ADHD. And I would ask them, hey, are there already things that you are using when you have a problem? I would give them a specific selected list of digital interventions in the game and say, hey, you are frustrated. How do you cope with that? Why don't you try a breathing exercise? Or what kind of intervention would you want to do? So I would basically start out with having the affected person telling you whether this is something that they can see is helping them in that moment. And the goal is just to have that also see what exactly is it that it calms them down. So when you are, I think the best analogy that I can make is think of Gearshift Fellowship as a flight simulator. And you are an astronaut who has to basically learn how to cope with the wizard that starts in your head when you have to endure these G-forces on you, you know. So they are basically also connected with a coach that tells you, okay, make this breathing exercise. And they are over time learn how to basically cope with that physical stress. And this is the same that I would administer here. So you have this access to the tools of interventions, and you get confronted with this truck that is screwing you over, that is permanently screwing you over. Now you could say, well, I'm just a person who is not lovable. You could say, this person is mean. All people are mean. I'm never going to trust anyone anymore. I'm only going to look at myself. So those are very extreme responses, right? but very responses that you basically do see in people with anxiety and with people with delusions or depression. So then what you want is to gently nudge them in these situations, say like, are really all people bad? How do you keep your agency when you lose the control? Could it be a possibility that you see opportunity in that challenge that the other person is always screwing you over? So those are the things that where I am hopeful we can integrate aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy, behavioral activation, and logotherapy. So the critical ingredient that I add in gear shift is like logotherapy, because the framework of adaptability that I vouch is adaptation is not only adjusting of your strategy. It's very, very often adjusting meaning, reconfiguring how you get the motivation, reconfiguring what is your goal, given the circumstances that you cannot control everything. And that aspect of loss of control is something that very often we forget, or we have to teach again people with anxiety or depression. So when you talk with people with depression, very often they say, I want to get better, I want to just feel good. And the aspect that they have lost under the concept of, we also phrase this as learned helplessness, is that they have lost the belief or the ability to see a potential possibility for agency, to see how to regain control. So it's under the concept of empowering people, giving people the power back of agency, even though you don't want to belittle or deny that they can't control everything. And I think that is exactly the nuanced way of adaptation, the way I have been thinking about from an integrative perspective.
Russell.
Yeah. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Nadja, can you address how this game is it standalone? Can it be used in conjunction with a therapist? Will the therapist get the data, get model parameters? And if so, can the therapist tune the game to direct the patient? Is GearShift fellowship like a sort of like a lab? And if you're familiar with MyChart, you know, the online document sharing and billing and all that systems that are going up around the world. Will GearShift fellowship generate a report that the patient and the therapist can see?
So the goal is to empower first the user and to have the user decide what they want to share with the therapist, first of all. What we want is not to actually add additional burden to the therapist. So we don't want to give them computational markers and like a list of 100 different markers. They sometimes get that already from neurocognitive tasks, but we want this very tailored information. We want to tell them, hey, this person didn't sleep well. It looks like they aren't anymore responsive to positive feedback. So don't try to encourage them. Maybe there is another aspect how you can shift your conversation today. So very tailored, a tailored interface for the clinicians to have very succinct information that they are already using in their clinical care, but that type of information that they only get when they speak with the person for 40 minutes, which basically is very difficult because they don't have the time. So we want to bridge this aspect that the clinician can give a much better use of their time while they see the patient, and maybe also guide remotely. So, you know, the clinician should have the opportunity, if the user wants, to integrate new interventions, to propose new aspects, or to also sometimes just monitor and say, hey, I see you are often using this intervention. That's great, but why don't you try also that? Depending on what exactly the user wants. So that is the goal of the Ging-Jehli Fellowship, is to create a multi-purpose platform where the scientists can ask the questions they need to for addressing brain mechanisms. The clinician gets information that they need. You can integrate also, maybe I can show you this specific, if I have it somewhere. Let me skip out of that. You basically appreciate there are these different stakeholders, and each of these stakeholders have a different, they have a different desire, a different goal. So you can integrate also the government or pharmacy industry that would get aggregated information of what an intervention is doing. So you wouldn't share individual data, but you would share data that is useful for them. So as an economist, of course, I'm always representing this with such a slide. So let me share this with you. So in this slide, what you can see is how each of the stakeholders really has their own interface. So you have the user who gets this proactive management, so they can find out exactly how they can become better in whatever they want to achieve. You have the insurance companies that would get aggregated information about remissions, ER submissions, drug misuse. You have the researchers that get access to a platform where they can ask their mechanistic questions, and you have healthcare providers that get the smart information. So it's a platform that has these tailored interfaces. It's not that everyone gets the model parameters. But we would want, if you are interested, we would want to share that with you.
Thumbs up, Russell? Good? Okay, perfect.
Sounds good. Thank you, Nadja.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think we're really close to finishing up this session today. I have a final one, which is related to real-world applicability and the burden of how long does it take to figure out what is the next best configuration, etc. As we do a lot of studies in real-world settings, you know, the burden of interventions is huge. And if you want to develop something like a just-in-time adaptive intervention, the question is always, how do you measure the vulnerable state in the most, you know, unobtrusive way to then suggest the most or most effective or potentially most effective intervention component, etc. So we saw a lot of lab experiments here. Where are we in terms of external validity and applicability in real-world context? And maybe this is really something we do together the next couple of years, right?
So in terms of applicability, we first have to appreciate it's a prototype. There are many ways how we want to make it so that we need less amount of data. It is therefore modular. So depending on what aspect, for instance, the clinical collaboration with LIBOR, they said, Nadja, I think this is a fantastic thing. And we have our patients coming in and they are waiting anyhow for 40 minutes in the waiting room. And so the question is, could we do it for just 30 minutes? And I'm like, okay, no problem. We have modular missions, so we can tailor it down to 30 minutes. We have another person, a collaborator, who says, oh, I really want to holistically study, and I even pay people, and I'm doing this in the lab. So can I just use all the missions? Yes, of course, then you can use all the missions, but then it's like 5 missions, right? And so the question for us is, where would we eventually want to end up? My goal, end goal, which maybe, you know, the next predecessors from me will basically achieve it, is that it's a very quick scan in the morning in the mirror while you are brushing your teeth that says, this is how you're fit for the day. Let's adjust your schedule. Today you look horrible. You basically, you are better served in just coding and not socially interacting with anyone. So let's rearrange your schedule. I do it just for you. That would be my absolute ultimate dream, because then you are completely 100% optimally adapting, right? You're restructuring your goal based on your current mental state. And I think that is the end goal, that is a very, very long process. What I can tell you from the figures in the US, we know about 80% of the entire population up to 85 is using games. People love playing games. People love playing games in particular if they get something out of it. And the goal is to use this platform to really help people in an engaging and lighthearted way, to tell them how fit are you for the day today. That's all that we want to achieve. And I strongly believe that this is sufficient to have people play this for 10-15 minutes, because they play already up to 30-45 minutes when they commute, when they read a newspaper. They are already playing these addictive games. So the question is more, how can you then induce such an aspect and make it basically meaningful, you know, so that people don't play Tetris just for Tetris purpose. So I think there is a long way to go to address your question, but we see that we can already adjust to the different locations where we have already started our partnerships.
Wonderful. Thank you